Vice President Fielder, are you on?
Yes, Mr. President. Thank you. I am.
All right. Commissioner O'Donnell?
Yes, sir.
All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. Now 9:31 a.m. Today's date is Tuesday, January 23rd, 2024. This is the time and place for our regularly scheduled business meeting. We are at the offices of the Public Service Commission in the Bollinger Room. I'll call this meeting to order. Would my colleagues join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you, colleagues. I would note for the record that Commissioner Panochi, myself, and Commissioner Bukacek are present in the Bollinger Room. Vice President Fielder and Commissioner O'Donnell are participating online. Therefore, we do have quorum this morning. All right. The Montana Public Service Commission welcomes public comment on any matter that is on today's agenda or on any matter that is within the jurisdiction of the Montana Public Service Commission. Are there any public commenters in the room? Any public commenters in the room? Seeing none. Are there any public commenters online? Being told there are not. So no public comment this morning. There are no changes to the agenda this morning, so we'll roll right into our action items. Action item number 1 is approval of commission minutes for the week of January 8, 2024. Is there a motion? Commissioner Bukacek?
I make a motion that we approve the minutes the week of January 8th, 2024.
Is there a second?
I will second.
So we have a motion and second. All right, on the minutes, are there any changes to the minutes as drafted? Revisions, edits?
Question, Mr. President.
Yes, Vice President Fielder.
Thank you. The minutes are not appearing in the electronic packet attached to this meeting. So I did review the draft minutes. I had a minor edit suggestion, and I don't know if that was included or not.
All right, would you like to tell us what it is?
Yeah, there was some language in there involving the railway and pipeline programs, and each of the presentation description entries was followed up with a commission took no action. And I just thought that was unnecessary to include that in there because there's several times when we have information presented and public comment and things like that where the commission takes no action. So I thought it would be just clutter up the minutes to include that every time there's something that we didn't take action on. So I suggested that that language be stricken from the end of each of those paragraphs.
In the version of the minutes I have, that language is in there. The commission took no action. Would you like to move to amend the minutes to strike those?
I believe it would be keeping with Robert's rules to go ahead and strike those, unless I'm corrected. So I will go ahead and move to strike that commentary from the minutes.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor to strike the sentences contained under both pipeline safety and railroad safety update that reads the commission took no action. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Commissioner Bukacek has seconded. Is there discussion?
Mr. President, I just think it helps the minutes keep clean and consistent.
Okay. Additional discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of Commissioner Vice President Fielder's motion to strike the two sentences from the minutes that read the commission took no action, signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. Seeing no opposition, motion carries. So back to the minutes as amended. Additional discussion on those? Seeing none, all those in favor of The motion as amended to adopt the minutes for the week of January 8, 2024, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. Seeing no opposition, motion carries. So, minutes as amended. All right, work session item number 1. This is docket 2022.07.078 Northwestern Energy. This is Northwestern's application for authority to increase retail electric and natural gas utility service rates and for approval of electric and natural gas service schedules and rules and allocated cost service. We're here to consider the 3 pending motions for reconsideration in this matter. Mr. Hamilton.
Good morning, Mr. President and Commissioners. As the President just noted, this particular work session is about Northwestern Energy's general electric and natural gas rate case. The Commission will recall that on October 27th, we met and discussed the final order for this particular case. The Commission subsequently issued its decision in Order 7860Y. After that, per Commission rules, we have a period of time for motions for reconsideration, and we did receive 3 motions for reconsideration. First was from 350 Montana, which was filed on November 3rd, 2023. Next was Broadreach, which was filed on November 6th, 2023. And finally, we had a joint motion from Human Resources Council, Natural Resources Defense Council, and the Northwest Energy Coalition, who I will refer to as the joint parties through the rest of this presentation. In your meeting materials for today, you have a staff memo that briefly summarizes the proposed resolution of each of the parties' claimed errors in Final Order 7860Y. You also have the full draft order on reconsideration, which will be the basis for staff's recommendation today. Mr. President, I propose that we go through each of the parties' motions in order. There are several issues addressed through these motions, and depending on your preferences, we can either pause after each issue for questions about that issue or just continue on and leave questions for the end.
I think the best method would be to pause after each individual issue.
Very good. In that case, Mr. President, we'll begin with 350 Montana. 350 Montana's first issue of alleged error said the Commission's order should require any future filing regarding cost recovery for the Yellowstone County Generating Station to address the issue of carbon emissions from the plant. In the draft order, the staff's recommendation concludes that carbon emissions will already be an issue in any future case. Sorry, the case described at least in paragraph 242 of Order 7860Y. Because of the full information required for prudence review under the Montana pre-approval statute. Now, YCGS, when it was previously known as the Laurel Generating Station, was the subject of an application for pre-approval. And with that application, Northwestern was required to submit a cost-effective carbon offset plan pursuant to Montana Code Annotated Section 69-8-421-6E. Final Order 7860Y required Northwestern to submit testimony on the same issues that were covered in its prior application. So cost-effective carbon offset planning would, again, be an issue. I would also note that interveners may raise additional issues in contested cases, provided they comply with Commission rules, specifically Montana Administrative Rule 38.2.2407, Part 3E. So, as a result, the draft order denies reconsideration on this point because the cost-effective carbon offset plan will already be discussed in a future PCAM-based prudence review if Northwestern decides to pursue that method of review. With that, are there any questions about issue number 1?
Not a question, but a point perhaps that you can just reaffirm. So carbon review would only apply under our October order if Northwestern comes in and seeks an adjustment to the PCAM, correct?
That's correct. Mr. President, paragraph 242 of the order was addressing the minimum filing requirement that the Commission would expect if Northwestern proceeds with that one-time PCAM true-up, which we'll discuss in greater detail in subsequent issues here today. But That list of issues to be addressed was particular to the unique proposal that the settling parties had come up with.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Additional questions? Seeing none, go ahead and proceed.
All right, moving on to issue number 2. Here, 350 Montana alleges that the commission's reasonable range analysis lacked legal and factual support. The draft order again denies reconsideration on this issue. For legal support, the draft order cites a number of cases in which this commission and courts have recognized and acknowledged, and in fact relied upon, the range of reasonableness. It also discusses some watershed U.S. Supreme Court cases that acknowledge the range of reasonableness for evaluating rate making in this context. As for factual support, the factual basis for the range of reasonableness analysis used in the commission's final decision were derived from the testimony and party positions developed through the entire course of this case. They were discussed at length in the commission's 100-plus page order, so they are not repeated again in this order on reconsideration. But without repeating all those same facts and analysis, the draft order still concludes that the range of reasonable analysis has both legal and factual support, and therefore reconsideration is not required.
Questions? Questions?
Mr. President,
Yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
thank you. Mr. Hamilton, you referred to other courts have affirmed range of reasonableness. Now, my question was, have they used those precise words?
Mr. President and Commissioner O'Donnell, yes, you can find the phrase range of reasonableness, reasonable range, zone of reasonableness, or reasonable zone. Variations of those terms in a number of cases. That the primary case that is discussed in the draft order is Duquesne Light Company, a U.S. Supreme Court case that used, I believe, and I'm not actually looking at the case right now, so I can't confirm the precise language, but I believe it did use a variation of the phrase range of reasonableness.
Very good. Thank you, sir.
Additional questions? Seeing none, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Moving on to issue number 3. Here, 350 Montana argues that the commission should not authorize recovery of YCGS, the Yellowstone County Generating Station, through a one-time adjustment to the Power Costs and Credits Adjustment Mechanism, or PCAM. The resolution in this draft order affirms the resolution from the commission's final order. To the extent it was unclear, the draft order on reconsideration clarifies that the commission's decision did not formally decide whether Northwestern can proceed with a one-time adjustment to the PCAM to recover costs of YCGS. Rather, the final order recognized that the stipulating parties had agreed with one another not to oppose an application submitted in that procedure. I should clarify here, they can still oppose the merits, I suppose, of Northwestern's application, but to the procedure, the settling parties are not raising any objections. The commission's final order, however, did not foreclose any objections, any procedural issues that any non-settling party may raise. It also emphasizes that the commission itself is not a party to the settlement agreement. So the commission has not decided whether a one-time PCAM adjustment is an appropriate or proper method of recovering costs for the Yellowstone County Generating Station. And I'd take any questions on that issue at this point.
Any questions on this particular issue? Questions? Seeing none, please proceed.
Moving on to issue number 4. The commission, here the 350 Montana argues the commission should remove $3.5 million from Northwestern's revenue requirement to reflect the difference in the previously authorized cost of debt for Colstrip Unit 4 and Northwestern's actual realized cost of debt for Colstrip Unit 4. The draft order concludes that 350 Montana did not provide a sufficient legal analysis of the basis for this particular adjustment in light of the pre-approval statute and the commission's prior orders. The draft order concludes that the adjustment, if adopted, would also result in a an adjustment to the reasonable range that would still leave the settlement agreement within the reasonable range. So for those two reasons, the draft order on reconsideration denies reconsideration on this cost of debt question for Colstrip Unit 4. Any questions?
Mr. Hamilton,
Yes.
I do have questions on this one. So I think it'd probably be beneficial for the public to understand a little bit more about the history of this particular issue. So it's my understanding that in 2008, a prior version of this commission issued an order which was 6925 small f and docket D 2008.6.69, which authorized or approved placing CU4, Colstrip Unit 4, in Northwestern's rate base, correct?
That is correct.
So your reconsideration in this matter that we're presently considering is essentially, well, could it be considered a request to amend a prior commission's order, namely 6925F?
Mr. President, I believe that is a legal question that could fairly arise from this scenario because the prior commission's order indicated that the cost of debt for Colstrip Unit 4 would be, I believe, 6.5% for the life of the plant. And that for the life of the plant language comes directly from the commission's prior order. So to modify Northwestern's revenue requirement in this case to reflect a different cost of debt than what the commission previously authorized does raise questions about whether or not you are in fact reconsidering the prior commission's order at this point. I will say that the draft order on reconsideration doesn't answer that legal question because we don't have adequate legal analysis to determine whether that is the case, whether that's prudent, whether that's lawful.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. I think your last answer or point answered the point that I would make as to this particular issue is that it is, as I understand, Commission's staff's recommendation that 350 Montana in this particular issue did not meet its burden to show that this would even be perhaps legally permissible for us to engage in what I would consider perhaps retroactive rate making.
Mr. President, that's correct. The commission's staff has not used the term retroactive rate making in this circumstance. There are some complications that we would need to think through on this, but it is still the point that commission staff has not been persuaded that 350 Montana has provided the complete legal argument that's required to make that modification.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Additional discussion? Seeing none, please proceed.
All right. Moving on to issue number 5 raised by 350 Montana. Here, 350 argues that the commission should exclude the costs of all advertising from Northwestern's revenue requirement. Backstory here, commissioners, is there is a state statute that disallows certain categories of advertising expense from rate recovery. The draft order on reconsideration, however, finds there is adequate record evidence to establish that all costs that need to be excluded from the revenue requirement were in fact excluded from the revenue requirement when Northwestern submitted its application. We have testimony, pre-filed testimony from Northwestern's accounting witness, as well as in-hearing testimony from its vice president and chief financial officer, Crystal Lale, that also averred there was no impermissible advertising expense included with the original filing. 350 Montana has asserted that a line item accounting of advertising expenses is necessary here. However, the draft order follows the statutory rule of evidence that testimony from a credible witness is sufficient to prove a fact. And because we have testimony from witnesses that at least we would recommend on this point finding credible, there is no need for further evidence to support the point. So again, the draft order on reconsideration recommends denying reconsideration on this issue. And I would take any questions at this time.
Questions? Questions? Seeing none, please proceed.
All right, thank you, Mr. President. Next issue, issue number 6, the final issue from 350 Montana alleges that the allocation of the revenue requirement in Order 7860Y unjustly discriminated against residential and small business customers. For this, I'm actually going to pass it over to regulatory staff, specifically Mr. Mike Dalton.
Dalton, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. President, and good morning, Commissioners. In its motion for reconsideration, 350 Montana asserts that the Commission's final order in this case discriminates between customer classes and unfairly imposes the bulk of the revenue requirement increase on residential and small business customers. In economic terms, discrimination is generally defined as charging a different rate to different customers, which are similarly situated in their circumstances and the services that they are being provided. In its motion, 350 Montana did not argue that the circumstances of any two customer classes are similarly situated, nor did it dispute that there is a legitimate basis for having different rates for different customer classes. The 350 Montana motion does not point to any facts in the record to prove that the final is discriminatory, but it does ask the Commission to balance record evidence in this case against the stipulated electric revenue allocation. The draft order on reconsideration grants that request. The parties that provided testimony on the subject of cost allocation agree that the act of setting rates for public utilities commonly relies on the use of an embedded cost of service study, or ECOS, to allocate total utility cost of service amongst the utility's different classes of customers. The cost of service for each customer class is compared to revenues earned from each class in order to determine the rate of return the utility is earning from each class. The results are used to guide recommendations for cost allocation. The only two parties to file an ECOS in this case were Northwestern Energy and the large customer group. The Montana Consumer Council, FEA, and Walmart provided testimony regarding the merit of the ECOS studies. All parties that provided testimony on the subject generally supported the approach taken in one of the two cost studies filed. MCC testified that the results of the Northwestern's ECOS fairly represent class cost of service and recommended that the Commission use it to set class revenue responsibilities. 350 Montana did not provide testimony to address the merits of either ECOS that was filed, nor did it file an independent cost study. Both cost studies that were provided in evidence indicate that the residential class is providing below its cost of service to the utility. The settling parties recognize that it is not always reasonable to set rates equal to the cost of service. The parties advocate for class revenue allocations that attempt to balance moving each class towards its cost of service, but try to take into account principles of gradualism and moderation to mitigate rate shocks to any one customer class. Northwestern proposed to moderate rates by capping the increase to any class at about 24% and a minimum increase of 15% to all classes. MCC generally supported Northwestern's moderation approach, but stated that if a different revenue requirement is approved, no class should receive an increase larger than 1.25 times the system average, and each class should bear at least an increase of 0.53 times the system average. LCG supported Northwestern's proposed cap of 24%, but argued that it should be applied to revenues which include property taxes rather than exclude property taxes. LCG also opposed including a minimum rate increase to any class. FEA argued that Northwestern's approach does not move customer classes close enough to their cost of service and proposed a rate cap to any class of 1.5 times the system average. The draft order on reconsideration rejects FEA's moderation proposal because it does not go far enough to moderate rates for the most affected customer classes. In its final order, the Commission determined a reasonable range of increase to Northwestern's total revenue requirement. Staff has adjusted the Northwestern and LCG moderation proposals to reflect the upper and lower bounds of the reasonable range approved in the final order. All class revenue allocations in the stipulation for all customer classes fall within the upper and lower bounds of the reasonable range of revenue requirement when the moderation proposals are applied to those bounds. The revenue allocations in the stipulation also comport with the MCC's recommendation that no class receive an increase larger than 1.25 times the system average. The embedded cost studies in the record showed that residential customers should receive a rate increase of at least 22% and potentially up to 26%. The stipulation attempts to mitigate this impact by reducing the increase to the residential class to 18.2%. This mitigation approach in the stipulation means that other classes must subsidize the residential class in the amount of somewhere between $8 million and $19 million per year. The stipulation calls for no increase to the primary general service and transmission customers because the cost studies in the record indicate the two customer classes are already subsidizing other classes and should actually receive a decrease in rates. The stipulated increase to irrigation and lighting customers is equal to their cost of service as identified in Northwestern's cost study. The stipulated increase to the secondary general service class is slightly greater than the amount identified in either cost study, but the larger increase is consistent with the moderation proposals in the record, which depend on other customer classes to subsidize and mitigate rate impacts to the residential class. Based on this analysis, staff finds that the class revenue allocations in the stipulation are reasonable, supported by substantial evidence in the record, and are not unjustly discriminatory. And I'm available for questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Dalton. That was quite comprehensive and informative. Questions? Commissioner Bukacek?
Not a question, just so well done that it removes all my need for elucidation for the public. It was perfect.
I guess I might have one question for you, Mr. Dalton, just to, for public awareness. When you use the term subsidize, correct, as part of your presentation?
Yes, Mr. President.
It's fair to say that when you use the term, and you can correct me on this, but when you use the term subsidize, what you're really saying is that under these cost of service studies, when the studies were done, they were looking at how to allocate a rate increase across the various classes, correct?
That's correct.
And ultimately, when you talk about subsidization, what you're saying is that the cost of service studies stated that certain classes, it's a cost cause or cost benefit type analysis, correct?
Yes.
Where certain classes should be allocated a greater share of the cost increase, correct?
Yes.
But in order to mitigate concerns regarding rate shock, the term subsidy means that those classes that may be responsible, if you will, for or need to or should evidentiarily receive the highest increase don't always receive it, correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
So what that means is that other classes that should, in theory, under these studies, receive a certain set limit for the cost increase actually are bearing a higher cost, correct?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Additional discussion?
Mr. President,
Vice President Fielder.
thank you. Just appreciate the line of questioning there, and I just want to be clear that it's my understanding, based on the record evidence and the cost of service studies, that the larger customer classes, like the large customer group and the utility, like the large customer group and the federal agency, they are actually under our order. Those larger consumer groups or industry groups are subsidizing the residential and small business customer classes. Is that correct, Mr. Dalton?
Mr. President, Commissioner Fielder, it's correct that there are other classes which are subsidizing the residential class according to the cost studies in the record and the revenue allocations that were approved in the stipulation. Does that answer your question?
I think it does answer the question. I think that the argument here that 350 made that the commission order unjustly discriminates against residential and small business customer classes is actually in reverse. It's I don't know if I should say in reverse, but certainly the order has softened the blow to those classes at the expense of other classes in order to lessen rate shock on residential and small business customer classes. Is that correct?
Mr. President, Commissioner Fielder, yes, that is correct. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all, Mr. President.
Just a quick comment.
Vice
If you don't-
or Commissioner Bukacek?
It just seemed like on the part of 350 Montana, it was an emotional appeal to make it look like it was something opposite of what it actually is. And I think it's important that residential customers really understand very clearly, and I think you made it very clear, that residential customers are actually charged less than the cost of their service. Is that correct?
Mr. President, Commissioner Bukacek, yes, that is
Thank you
correct.
so much.
Yep.
All right, additional questions? Seeing none, next issue, Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll take back over at this point to move on to our second motion for reconsideration. In at least the order discussed in the draft order on reconsideration comes from Broadreach. The sole issue raised by Broadreach is that by denying requests to reschedule the hearing after the settlement agreement was filed, the commission denied Broadreach due process. Procedural due process in a legal sense is not a strict standard. It is a flexible standard that moves to meet the circumstances. The draft order concludes that Broadreach was not denied due process because the burden of canceling the hearing and requiring additional pre-filed testimony and discovery would have outweighed the benefit obtained. And it's that burden versus benefit analysis that is the traditional tool employed by courts to evaluate procedural due process claims. It's also important to note, as is discussed at length in the draft order on reconsideration, that the settlement agreement did not narrow the scope of the hearing. It did not prevent any non-settling parties from inquiring into or advocating for any particular position, including the original positions of the settling parties. So the 6-day hearing that the commission held on this was wide-ranging. It was not narrowed to just the settlement agreement. Parties did, in fact, inquire into issues that were beside the settlement agreement and addressed by the settlement agreement. So really, the 6-day hearing was as broad as it could be. The draft order also notes that there are several elements of a due process claim that are missing from Broadreach's argument, most notably a request for relief. In other words, even if the commission were persuaded that there was a due process problem here, Broadreach does not provide any specific relief for that issue, and therefore the commission would be left to speculate about what would satisfy this problem. For these reasons, the draft order on reconsideration recommends denying reconsideration pursuant to Broadreach's motion. Be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions? Commissioner Bukacek?
Yes, Mr. Hamilton. In addition to having those 6 days where they were able to weigh in, Broadreach Power, their counsel also had access to the same thousands of pages of pre-filed testimony that we had, correct? And in the same timely fashion.
Mr. President and Commissioner Bukacek, that is correct. The analysis required to evaluate the reasonableness of the settlement agreement came from evidence that was submitted with Northwestern's original position, its responses to discovery, the intervening parties' original positions, including the original positions of the settling parties, all of which were subject to extensive discovery, the cross-intervener testimony, the rebuttal testimony. All of that record was developed over the procedural history of this case, which began with the commission's procedural order 7860B issued in September of 2022 and carried on through the schedule that was set in that order, which culminated in, well, first, an April 3rd deadline for settlement agreements, and then second, the hearing, which was originally set for April 10th and then moved 1 day to accommodate travel for Easter to April 11th.
And that clarifies what was going to be my second request, had to do with the 7860B from September of 2022. And that's when the different parties agreed to the terms and the time frame.
Mr. President, Commissioner Bukacek, that's correct. The procedural order was issued in September of 2022. Those deadlines were all, I believe, floated by the parties informally before the procedural order was issued. And in any event, if any party disagreed with those deadlines, there was an opportunity to move for reconsideration of the procedural order and change those deadlines.
In light of the clarification, the way you explained everything, the comments by the council in chief that our final order is somehow, quote, unlawful, unjust, and unreasonable appears to me to be completely without substance.
Additional questions? Additional questions? Seeing none? Ms. Goldberg?
Good morning, Commissioners. The joint parties asked the Commission to revisit and clarify paragraph 294 of Order 7860Y and require Northwestern to make the DSM Advisory Group permanent. Alternatively, the joint parties asked the Commission to make it explicit that DSM program implementations must be addressed in whatever stakeholder process the draft order envisions. Since Northwestern's last rate case in 2018, which resulted in the DSM Advisory Group, the Montana legislature enacted provisions in the Integrated Least Cost Resource Planning and Acquisition Act, mandating that Northwestern maintain a broad-based advisory committee to address technical, economic, and policy issues related to its electricity system, including DSM. This is found at MCA 69-3-1208. So by law, a Northwestern stakeholder group focus on DSM has already been made permanent. To that end, the draft order that clarifies Northwestern is expected to maintain that permanent stakeholder group to evaluate and provide input on DSM, planning, acquisition, policies, and procedures consistent with the statute. The draft order also sets expectations that Northwestern expand its engagement with stakeholders outside of its designated advisory group to include members of the existing DSM advisory group and others as appropriate in ongoing discussions in DSM planning and acquisition. And I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. Any questions? Questions for Ms. Goldberg? Seeing none? Mr. Hamilton? Oh, Ms. Goldberg?
Switching gears now to the second portion of the joint parties motion, which states that impacts to low and moderate income customers are a relevant factor in determining reasonableness and justness of rates, and therefore the Commission must reconsider the effect of its decision to approve the settlement on low and moderate income customers and provide reasoned analysis justifying the impacts. The joint parties motion also asks that the Commission require Northwestern to evaluate its low-income bill discount and weatherization programs through a stakeholder process. Commission staff derived electric bill impacts for low-income customers using attachment D1 of the settlement compliance work papers. In the test year for this rate review, Northwestern served approximately 10,458 customers who were designated as low income. On a weather normalized basis, those low-income customers use, on average, 695 kilowatt hours of electricity per month. Northwestern's pre-existing residential electric tariff provides rate discounts for qualifying low-income customers. The discount is 15% of the total electric bill during summer months and 25% during the winter months. Assuming a total usage of 695 kilowatt hours per month per customer and factoring in the tariff rate discounts, the settlement results in a total low-income bill impact of about $15 per month in winter months and $17 in summer months compared to rates in effect in August 2022. The rate discount supplement other bill assistance programs provided through LIHEAP, as well as private organizations such as Energy Share of Montana that also receive funding through the USB program. Cost of service is a relevant discussion when setting rates for utility services, and the economics of public utility regulation. Whether rates are just and reasonable depends heavily on the degree to which they reflect the utility's cost to provide service, or said differently, the cost caused by the customer's use of utility facilities and services. In this case, the joint parties did not submit their own class cost of service study, nor did they contest the class cost of service studies submitted by Northwestern, which the MCC found reasonable, or the cost study by the large customer group. Additionally, none of the cost cost studies separately calculate the cost of serving low-income customers apart from the residential class as a whole. Consequently, the record lacks evidence supporting a standalone cost to serve the low-income customer subgroup of the residential rate class, other than what might already be embedded in the pre-existing rate discount. There is no evidentiary basis for treating low-income customers separately when setting rates. Finally, no party proposed modifying the existing low-income rate discounts. Evidence in the record regarding affordability is limited. At the hearing, Northwestern testified it does not collect data that allow for calculations of customers' energy burden. Instead, Northwestern monitors an affordability metric it refers to as share of wallet, which measures a ratio of average bills to average income on an aggregate basis. However, share of wallet measures specific to low-income customers are not in evidence. Faced with the prospect of double-digit utility rate increases, many public commenters were understandably concerned about the impacts on low-income customers. Commission staff sympathize with those concerns. While the joint parties claim that the settlement disproportionately impacts low-income customers may seem intuitive, the record evidence in this case is not sufficient to verify it, given the lack of affordability data that reflect the effects of existing low-income assistance in its various forms. Therefore, an evaluation of the efficacy of the available low-income energy assistance programs through a stakeholder process is warranted. At a minimum, the stakeholder process should attempt to address apparent information gaps concerning trends in energy affordability for low-income customers in relation to the residential class as a whole, barriers to participation in existing assistance programs, coordination across assistance programs, and the most effective outreach and delivery mechanisms for low-income assistance. The broad-based advisory committee required by statute will have a role, but the draft order also sets expectations for Northwestern to engage stakeholders beyond the advisory committee as necessary, while considering input from the advisory committee. Although record evidence does not enable the commission to determine whether existing low-income energy assistance measures are achieving affordability goals for low-income customers, it is reasonable to expect Northwestern to provide periodic reports that provide insight into that question. Therefore, the draft order directs that concurrent with the filing of its annual USB report in March 2024 and on an annual basis thereafter through its next rate review, Northwestern must file its share of wallet affordability calculations for the most recent 5 years, including underlying data and calculations. Northwestern must provide separate calculations for low-income customers and the full residential class. In addition, Northwestern must update the commission annually on the low-income stakeholder process. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gilbert. That was also very thorough and very well articulated. Thank you. Questions? Seeing none? All right, now back to you, Mr. Hamilton.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioners. That concludes staff's presentation of the draft order on reconsideration. To reiterate, it is staff's recommendation that the commission issue the draft order as its order on reconsideration and authorize staff to make non-substantive changes that are required for clarity and accuracy. So with that, I'd be happy to take any miscellaneous questions.
All right, I think we'll just move straight to the motion. Is there a motion, Commissioner Bukacek?
I move that we approve the draft order as the order on reconsideration of the commission allows staff to make non-substantive edits required for clarity.
All right, is there a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Pinochi has seconded. We have a motion and second. We have a motion on the floor. Discussion.
Mr. President.
Oh, Vice President Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just appreciate the effort that went into reviewing these arguments, and I feel very confident that the commission and its staff did very good work in this case and this matter. And I wish that prices across the board were not up so high in this country the way they are. But I believe the commission did the best that it could with the parameters that have been given to us under the law. So I will be supporting this motion, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Fielder. Commissioner Bukacek.
I echo Vice President Fielder's comments about our excellent staff and these presentations today, so elucidating, so clear, so thorough. And so, I've just begun my second year as Montana Public Service Commissioner, and having worked a full year with legal staff that is strict about sticking to evidentiary record. I appreciate that so much. And regulatory staff that is strict about using formulas based on pertinent, extensive data. I'm used to a high level of professionalism, and I so greatly appreciate that. So it was striking the absence of substantive factual arguments in the broad reach power and 350 Montana briefs. And I guess probably partly striking because I'm used to working with people so professional. The emotional appeals caused me to question whether they had listened to the multiple days of testimony of this rate case and whether they had read the final order that we issued October 27th of 2023. And I recognize, having lived long, the power and utility of emotional arguments when there's a lack of substantive arguments. But it's in the best interest for us commissioners to base our opinions always on the evidentiary record of facts and how they affect Montanans rather than going along with emotional misguidance. So our final order is based on the evidentiary record, and I support my own motion to approve the draft order as the order on reconsideration.
Thank you, Commissioner Bukacek. Additional discussion? Additional discussion? I would just note for the record at this point in time that I did read through the motions for reconsideration that were filed by the three non-settling parties in this matter. And my vote on reconsideration will be based on argument made by the parties asking for reconsideration and on the evidentiary record that was elucidated through the 6-day hearing that was held in this matter. Additional discussion? All right, seeing none. All those in favor of Commissioner Bukacek's motion signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed signify by saying no. Seeing no opposition, motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you, staff. Excellent work, as always. Very thorough. All right, we did get a request from our technical staff to take a 5-minute break to adjust for the next topic. So why don't we go into recess here? The time is now 10:19. We'll take 6 minutes. We'll come back at 10:25. All right, the time is now 10:27 a.m. Back on the record, if you will. We had left off with concluding work session item number 1, so let's move to work session item number 2. This is a commission-initiated matter. To give commissioner travel reports. We're here to have commissioners who have traveled in the relevant period to provide an update to the public on the purpose of the commissioner's travel in conformance with our agency Blue Book policy and to discuss how the same benefited the agency. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I've arranged with Commissioner Bukacek that she would initiate our discussion of our meeting, the Bonneville Power Administration for the commissioners in the 4 northwestern states.
All right, very good. And then based on that representation, Commissioner Bukacek.
I'm going to try to go through these quickly. So it was a 3-hour meeting, January 11th, Bonneville Power Administration for State Public Utility Commission meeting. And that's the Bonneville Dam right there, 40 miles from Portland. So I'm going to go through a lot of these as quickly as I can. This was the meeting agenda. I'm going to speak about 2 agenda items today, the Commissioner Roundtable discussion and the Transmission Planning and Infrastructure discussion. And then Commissioner O'Donnell will report on the rest. So transmission planning and infrastructure, the transmission and infrastructure leadership that Bonneville Power has taken, that was discussed at some length. Many different operating scenarios to manage transmission line congestion and rising load growth. BPA, I'm going to call them that from here on out, completed its 2023 study. There were 14 projects that emerged, currently in each of those in a phase of permitting and design. This transmission for 150 gigawatts, it's in some phases of study. Proven technology incorporated into design standards. Design group takes into consideration what is most efficient and cost effective. Maximizing efficiency and cost effectiveness includes considering reconductoring, reconfiguring, and high efficiency transmission products. Maximizing efficiency and cost effectiveness includes making efficient use of existing transmission corridors, including underutilized corridors whenever possible. CREBC, that's supposed to be a P there. CREBC Transmission Collaborative kickoff was January 12th, 2024. The Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperative from CREBC, I did get it right there. Montana's own Robin Arnold is spearheading that. For most of us listening, Robin Arnold needs no introduction. She worked for the Montana Public Service Commission for 7 years, and her work here included analyzing transmission policy. Ms. Arnold then worked for Renewables Northwest, and now she is on the Western Interstate Energy Board, Director of State, Federal, and International Affairs. So we're going to be in on her calls and webinars. The focus of my comments when I was at the meeting, were 1, the current deficit of minerals needed for completion of transmission and infrastructure plans. And if 150 gigawatts of energy projection is based on so-called nameplate capacity for sun and wind power, the true gigawatt value will be far less than that 150 gigawatts. And I talked to some of these planners, these engineers. They gave great presentations on transmission plans that they have. And then when I asked them about the minerals, how are you going to be able to complete those if you don't have the minerals? And they said, well, we're just in the design phase. We don't have to deal with that at this point. So the roundtable discussion was interesting, very animated. Focus of discussion was what the BPA Chief Executive Officer, John Harrison, proclaimed. He called it the Fish Agreement. It's also known as the Secret Agreement to breach the Snake River dams. That's what I hear most commonly it called. The officially titled Columbia Basin Restoration Initiative. So I'm going to quickly go through this. Washington's lower Snake River dams, we're familiar with those, where they're located, quite beautiful. The Columbia Basin Restorative Initiative, there's a memorandum of understanding that was issued. And this is a photo of one of the Snake River dams. It was signed December 14th by Oregon and Washington governors, 5 federal agencies, and 4 tribes. The 5 government agencies were the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, BPA, National Marine Fisheries Services, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Uninvited were Montana, Idaho, and 6 tribes that were impacted by the initiative. So this initiative, 92 pages, including tables, attachments, and appendices in response to the CBRI objectives that were proposed by what they call the 6 sovereigns. I'm going to quickly go through these, but any of these slides are available if anybody wants them. These were objectives put out by the 6 sovereigns: develop and advance an urgent comprehensive strategy to restore salmon and steelhead to healthy and abundant levels, complete the actions and investigations necessary to secure continuity of services associated with Lower Snake River prior to dam breaching. Ensure that all native species are considered in the comprehensive strategy. Ensure that interim fish measures are adequate to minimize additional generation decline of fish populations. Invest in a manner that is consistent with meeting decarbonization goals and mandates and integration of renewables that deliver affordable and clean power. Secure necessary regulatory compliance authorization and appropriations with an urgency reflecting the needs of the fish. Objective 6, ensure that the strategy and associated federal actions, quote, honor federal commitments to tribal nations and address past and ongoing inequities. So Appendix A, the Department of Energy program proposal advancing tribal energy sovereignty in the Pacific Northwest. Number 1, tribal energy sovereignty resource planning process and tribal energy sovereignty project development. There are examples of funding available for this. And in all of these examples, these are given to multiple different groups, not just for CBRI. So when you see these millions and billions of dollars, it's not all going for CBRI, it's for multiple programs. Grid resilience grant funding, National Clean Investment Fund, efficient electric appliance rebates, energy improvement in rural and remote areas, Department of Energy tribal energy loans, grid resilience grant, tribal electrification program. BPA itself appropriated $300 million for fish restoration last September. And they also gave $900 million for endangered fish species. And this was back by 2008, they had put $900 million. So this precedes this. But you can see it's over a billion that BPA has put toward this. So the objections by the public service commissioners to the CBRI were of 2 basic categories. Category 1 was the illegality, immorality, and lack of ethics of not involving the other 8 sovereigns. And one of the commissioners discussed, multiple lawsuits that have been filed or will be filed. The federal government is quoted as saying they are committed to developing strategies through inclusive regional collaborative processes, yet they left Montana and others out, and multiple tribes out as well. So the category 2 of the Public Service Commissioner's objections had to do with questionable premises of the document itself. Questionable premise number 1, and I had a lot of this in a handout so this is pertinent and legitimate to the meeting. So questionable premise number 1, honoring the 1855 treaties between the United States and tribes gives tribes complete control over these rivers. That is what I consider a very questionable premise. It was considered questionable at this meeting. There are multiple 1855 treaties with the U.S. and tribes, probably a dozen of them, including peace treaties trying to bring peace between the tribes. And if you ever read these treaties, you could see that there's just a very vague reference. They're vaguely referenced in CBRI. They just say 1855 treaties. And the language is similar to identical in the treaties with the 4 tribes that signed CBRI. There's an absence, if you read these treaties carefully, an absence of delineation of clear definition of water rights. It doesn't exist. It's not clear, and I don't believe it would withstand unbiased legal review. Highly questionable premise number 2, megawatts from hydropower can be replaced with solar and wind. Clean, green, renewable hydropower is our strong suit in the Pacific Northwest, which is these 4 states that were represented here. It's not solar. It's not wind, but hydroelectric is greater than 75% of renewable energy in the Pacific Northwest. I've seen it as high as 83% of renewable energy in the Northwest. Take a look at sunny, windy California. California is number 5 in the nation, the 5th sunniest state. It also has a tremendous amount of wind in it. And yet, if you look at their 2021 California's portfolio for energy generation and energy incorporation, if you look at this closely, they say leading the state to 100% clean energy, future for all. And yet, if you look closely at these numbers, their number 1 source of energy is natural gas. And if you look down at the numbers in 2021 for solar and wind, it's less than 26% in 2021. In 2022, they switched the categories a little bit to put hydroelectric and nuclear in there. But solar and wind continue in this sunny, windy state to be less than 28% of their energy produced. So after 40 years of using solar and wind power in California, 40 years of subsidies for wind projects, solar and wind provide less than a third of California's electricity. Natural gas, a hydrocarbon, is California's #1 electricity source, also called fossil fuel. Natural gas is their #1. So anyway, I heard a sigh over there. Nobody sighed, I can go back. Okay, so solar and wind provide less than 28% of electricity in sunny, windy California, and it's thought solar and wind can replace hydropower megawatt for megawatt in the Pacific Northwest. It seems unlikely. Highly questionable premise number 3, and all these things were discussed, Mr. President. The impact of these dams on fish habitat is thought to be a legitimate use of hundreds of millions more taxpayer dollars. I think that's questionable. So let's look at the evidence. Let's look at the facts. By 2008, Bonneville Power had put in $900 million into fish habitat restoration. And if you look at, take into account inflation, it's actually like $9 billion roughly that they've put into it. And what is the outcome? This is kind of neat. I stumbled across this. This was in 2018. It was a report by the BPA that showed that we had 96% of those little fish that were going through the dam were surviving. So I think that's really good. And then in 2023, it's thought to be 98% of fish passage, successful fish passage. So, when I was going through school, 98% would be a high A. So I would say that's pretty good as far as minimizing additional generation decline, which was objective 3. I think we've done a really great job already. Seems questionable whether we should be putting millions of dollars into more of this. There was an Oregon State University study last July about that $9 billion when you're adjusting for inflation. And their conclusion was, while hatchery reared salmon numbers have increased, the fishies are passing through, there's no increase in wild, naturally spawning salmon. So again, objective number 2, we have to ensure that all native species can survive. So this is a little commentary on my part, excuse me, Mr. President, but, was this another project meant to fail? Always a way of bringing in alleged species that can keep kind of a slush fund going in perpetuity. As a medical doctor, I've spent decades devoted to helping people live through catastrophes. This is what doctors do. And because someone can name an endangered species of fish, my patients are going to die because of exposure to freezing temperatures and lack of medical care. So this initiative, billions more tax dollars going for fish recovery, hundreds of thousands of citizens at risk for losing power, irrigation, and navigation. And it's opening the door to more lawsuits based on vague language about fishing rights in the 1855 treaties. And I would really encourage everyone to read those treaties. They're not very long. So this initiative, CBRI, why are federal agencies and 2 state governments using your tax dollars to place you and hundreds of thousands of your neighbors at risk? Final commentary. These regulators and policymakers, they are dissociated from communities. They are not answerable to their community. As one immersed in my community, my clinic uses natural gas for heating and requires electricity to circulate that heat from the natural gas. The electricity needed for my patient care is provided by Flathead Electric Co-op and Bonneville Power Administration. Our local hospital likewise. If the power goes down, they might have a couple days with backup generators that are run by petroleum products. Once that is out, people will die within a short period of time. And are these practical matters being considered? Protecting human life and promoting human flourishing is not a game for me, nor is it a political football. I think virtual reality is fine for video games, but in this life and death struggle for power and water, let's be real. Thank you very much. Minimum commentary, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Bukacek. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Well, it's certainly
gives a great recommendation if somebody is looking for a medical doctor who will take adequate notes of your condition. We have just seen that in great detail. Now, I was at the same meeting. However, what's left over is some interesting facts that BPA indicated that they have 1,000 interconnection requests. I believe that's a year, which would indicate that the almost uncontrolled expansion of renewables in the Pacific Northwest along the BPA system right there. My impression is that renewables, as Commissioner Buchek was elaborating on, really decrease reliability, and reliability is the most important thing that commissioners have to be aware of for the obligation that we owe to the ratepayers of the state and even the voters of the state, is that our mandate as the Public Service Commission, and therefore to each commissioner, is to provide for adequate, reliable electricity. And of course, in Montana, we know that means, as Commissioner Bukacek pointed out, keeping people alive when it's really cold. So that 1,000 interconnection requests. One thing that struck me on that is that these are all, and Commissioner Bukacek also pointed out that BPA is talking about greater transmission building. At the same time as this, to me, increases unreliability, at the same time, all costs, whether it's as a taxpayer through subsidies or as a ratepayer through utility bills, is that every penny is paid for by the people at the receiving end. And I find this to be really interesting. In terms of what Commissioner Bukacek referred to as the reconductoring, there was a particular question of mine, is that when BPA said that they prioritizes the projects that they want to pursue, I asked them if they were factoring in at that stage the reconductoring. What I mean by that is, instead of building a whole brand new line, is that they would increase the capacity of the existing line and therefore save ratepayers money, and that would at the initial stage indicate whether or not a project qualifies in the top 10 or 20 on that, based upon if a project is going to cost $10 million as opposed to $5 million, that should be considered. BPA, to my surprise, said that they do not consider that initially. They select the projects, and then at some point down the road, I think, as Commissioner Bukacek also was pointing out, at some point down the road, then they take into account the actual mechanics of the transmission or of the project itself. It was very surprising to me to understand the demands on the BPA system. The system, as Commissioner Bukacek pointed out, is shrinking. The ability for the amount of power that can be counted upon to be carried on the BPA system is mostly hydro. She pointed out the assaults on the hydro system, which I think are very legitimate, and I thank her for pointing those out. At any rate, EPA seems to be, struck me as going along very, very strongly with the current agenda of doing everything it can to increase renewables. And that also is that it seems obvious to me that the only thing that can change that initiative to restore resource adequacy and reliable power to the areas, especially Montana, is a change in the overall attitude of regulators from Washington. And that the only thing that would bring that to happen is a complete collapse of what we have now, which there are very strong signs of that, or an administration change. Mr. President.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell, do either of you have an estimate of what your travel costs the agency per chance, which is one of the requirements of this
Yes, sir, I
presentation?
forgot to.
Yes, thank you.
Total of $969.95 plus a rental car because they wanted me to stay in Seattle 2 extra days and I didn't want to. I was stuck in Seattle because of the weather. So the rental car is not included in that $969.95.
All right, Commissioner O'Donnell.
I believe that I'm not in the office right now. That information, I calculated that and put it on the form that that I'm required to submit. I don't have that information at hand.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Pannocci.
No travel to report.
Vice President Fielder.
Mr. President, thank you. I do not have any commission travel to report this period. Thank you.
All right, and I do not have,
Mr. President.
yes, Commissioner O'Donnell.
One of the things I wanted to is that in continuing on this, I believe Commissioner Bukacek showed particular interest, as did I, on there are 2 webinars that are happening on January 25 and 29, having to do with this whole greater issue of energy in the West. Just to mention that. Those are webinars, so that would not impose any cost on the commission.
Okay, thank you. As I was stating, I did not engage in any commission-related travel during the prior period, so I have no report. All right, some housekeeping. Tomorrow at 10 a.m., agency will be before the Legislative Audit Committee to discuss the performance audit formed on the committee for the agency for the last 3 years. And then our next commission business meeting will be Tuesday, January 30th, 2024 at the usual time of 9:30 a.m. Seeing no further business to come before the commission this morning. Time is now 10:50 a.m. We will adjourn today's meeting.